Yes, again, thank you everybody for joining us for this 101 overview and policy debriefing on areas of critical environmental concern. My name is Eddie Sherman. I am Navajo in Omaha and an ATNI member, and I am a principal of Against the Current Consulting. And we have been working with ATNI on ACEC awareness, engagement, and education for a good part of this 2021 year, and reaching out to all of the ATNI member states where ATNI members reside. So from Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and northern Nevada. And so we've been reaching out to every single federally recognized tribe and a few state recognized tribes in those spaces, just to raise awareness about the opportunity around areas of critical environmental concern. And we were able to pass a resolution at the 2019 and the 2021 annual convention for ATNI. And we were continuing to raise awareness nationally. And one of the challenges that we've had is just, although that the areas of critical environmental concern has been part of a law since 1976, there have been just a lot of awareness and education around the issue itself, what it is, the protections that can be afforded through a rulemaking process. And so we thought it would be a great idea to follow up our efforts with this overview and policy debriefing. So we have some great speakers here today, and we'll have some time for some Q&A. But we've been fortunate to have Joel Moffitt, who is the former Natural Resources Policy Coordinator, join us, and he will be facilitating our conversation today. So again, we're encouraging folks to register, not register, but to introduce themselves, any tribal affiliation they might have, as well as what organization, tribe, or government they are representing. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to Joel.
Katsiaya, Eddie, thank you for that. As you mentioned, my name is Joel Moffitt, citizen of the Nez Perce tribe and former Natural Resource Policy Coordinator for affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. Currently, I serve as the Director of Environmental and Special Projects at Native Americans in Philanthropy. But it was a pleasure to get contacted by Eddie and asked to help facilitate this discussion, because it's a critical issue for tribes and protecting their lands and waters. And it's an issue that that we worked on heavily, as Eddie mentioned, at ATNI at the last annual convention. And but we also realized that even though the law has been around for over 40 years, it was not taken advantage of by tribes in protecting their lands and waters. And so it was known very little. And I'll admit that I knew very little about it until this last year. And so I appreciate Eddie taking the lead with Against the Current Consulting and Pew and having these educational webinars for tribes to understand what areas of critical environmental concern are within the Bureau of Land Management, and how tribes can take advantage of this opportunity with the Biden administration and the focus on conservation and protection, and what that means for tribes and our resources. So those are the objectives, really, is to learn about ACECs, learn about where tribes fit in to the rulemaking with Bureau of Land Management, and to hear from tribes, to hear from everybody on the call, on what your concerns are. If you have any questions, if you're familiar with ACECs, or if you would like more information on how to look at taking advantage of this process to protect your lands and waters. We'll look at this from a couple different angles. We'll look at it from a tribal perspective. We have a distinguished council member from Alaska, the Nulato Village tribe, and we have some legal and policy perspectives on this issue as well from some legal scholars, Mike Bloom at Lewis and Clark Law School, and Laura Williams from Pew. So without any further explanation, let's dive right into to the first presentation from Laurel Williams, giving a general description of the ACECs within Bureau of Land Management, and ground us in some knowledge about the law that created it and where it sits right now. So I'll hand it over to Laurel. If you could introduce yourself a little bit and then start your presentation. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Joel, and thanks so much to ATNI for having me here. This is really an honor to be here with you today. So my name is Laurel Williams. I'm a program officer with the U.S. Public Lands and Rivers Conservation Program at the Pew Charitable Trust, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. And I'm going to be talking today about a lesser known, as Joel noted, a lesser known conservation designation tool called Areas of Critical Environmental Concern. And I'll talk a little bit about how this tool can be used to protect ecologically and culturally significant lands. And I'll also talk about how this designation could be improved through an agency rulemaking and some opportunities for tribes to get involved in that. Before I dive into that, I do want to just say a couple words to acknowledge that all of the lands that we'll talk about today are the ancestral homelands of Indigenous people, many of whom continue to maintain connections to and to steward these lands today. And so indeed, wherever we may be joining from today is Indigenous land. And as I mentioned, I'm here in Portland. A number of other of us are also here in Portland, which is located on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, and Clackamas bands of Chinookan people, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and the Malala, and the Malala, whose living descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, and the Chinook Nation. So again, thanks for having me here today, and I'll go ahead and just dive into the presentation. So when we talk about areas of critical environmental concern, we first want to just talk a little bit about land tenure in the Western United States. And so you can see on these maps here, most of the land that we look at is managed by one of the federal agencies, either the Bureau of Land Management, which is shown in kind of this goldenrod color, the Forest Service shown in green, Fish and Wildlife Service in blue, Park Service in purple, and Department of Defense in red. And again, we acknowledge and honor that all of these lands are the indigenous or the ancestral homelands of Indigenous people. When we look across this map, it's worth noting that the Bureau of Land Management, again, that kind of goldenrod color, is the largest land manager in the United States today. So they manage about 245 million surface acres across the country. And so when we start to talk about areas of critical environmental concern, it's really these BLM lands that we're talking about that are eligible for an area of critical environmental concern designation. And so the way that the Bureau of Land Management manages their lands, BLM is an agency that is required to manage for what's called multiple use. So they manage for everything from oil and gas development and mining, livestock grazing, conservation, recreation. They really have a number of different uses that they're working to balance across their vast domain, the vast domain of lands that they manage. And BLM splits up its lands into these different planning unit boundaries that you can see on this map here. And every 20 or so years, BLM goes through a planning process called a resource management plan to update the guidance for how these lands will be managed. When BLM goes through this planning process, they are required to consult with tribes. They're also required to engage the public as well as local and state governments. And it's really through this planning process that areas of critical environmental concern will be evaluated and can be designated. So what are these areas of critical environmental concern, and why are they so important? And we call them ACECs, not ACDC, but ACEC. And so ACECs are a land designation that the Bureau of Land Management can apply to lands under their jurisdiction. And they're defined as areas of public lands where special management attention is required to protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historic, cultural, or scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, or other natural systems or processes, or to protect life and safety from natural hazards. And ACECs are specifically called out in the 1976 Federal Land Policy and Management Act that directs the BLM to prioritize the designation of ACECs through those land management planning processes. ACECs have significant potential to protect culturally and ecologically valuable landscapes, but they are underutilized in these planning processes. And so what makes an area eligible to be designated as an ACEC? There are kind of three main things: relevance and importance criteria, and then the need for special management. And so the first is this relevance criteria. And what this means is that the area must contain, again, significant historic, cultural, or scenic values, a fish and wildlife resource, or other natural system or process. So for example, this could mean a rare or sensitive archaeological resource, or a religious or cultural resource. It could be habitat for endangered or sensitive or threatened animal or plant species. It could be habitat that's essential for maintaining species diversity, rare endemic plants, rare geologic features. The second criterion is the importance. And so thinking about those values we just talked about, those values would have more than locally significant qualities that give them special worth, consequence, meaning, distinctiveness, or cause for concern, especially when compared with other similar resources. Or those values could have qualities or circumstances that make them fragile, sensitive, rare, irreplaceable, unique, threatened, and so on. These values could be recognized as warranting protection in order to satisfy national priority concerns, or to carry out the mandates of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. They could have qualities that warrant highlighting in order to satisfy public or management concerns about safety and public welfare, or finally, they could possess significant threat to human life and safety or property. And then finally, these areas must require special management attention in order to protect the important and relevant values. And special management attention here really refers to the management prescriptions that would be developed during that resource management planning process. And so the management prescriptions need to expressly protect the important and relevant values of the area from potential effects, and they should be unique in addressing the specific values of that area. And special management often also provides for consultation and coordination with identified groups and experts, such as tribes. And so the management of areas of critical environmental concern could include a lot of different things, such as an area could be recommended for withdrawal from mineral entry. It could be closed to energy leasing. It could be designated as a right-of-way exclusion area. It could be closed to the construction of new roads, designated as closed to motor vehicle use or limited to motor vehicle use, or restricted to construction of new structures and facilities. So let's look at a couple examples of areas of critical environmental concern. This area, Table Rocks, is here in Oregon, and it was designated as an ACEC because of the important plant and animal and unique geologic values. Specifically, there's a plant, a wildflower species that grows in this area that is found nowhere else on Earth. It's also, I think, worth noting that the Table Rocks area is co-managed between the Bureau of Land Management and the Grand Ronde and Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua tribe. So they work together. They have a memorandum of understanding to manage this area. Another example of an ACEC is Square Butte, which is located in kind of central Montana. And this area was designated as an ACEC because of the important archaeological and artifacts that have been found here that document over 9,000 years of human habitation. And the BLM, when evaluating this area, they noted that it is exceptionally rare for an area of its size to retain such a large number, density, and diversity of cultural properties. And then this area also has some secondary values, a mountain goat population and unique geologic features. In Alaska, Alaska tribes have nominated some 24 areas of critical environmental concern in 2 different planning areas, the Bering Sea Western Interior Plan and the Central Yukon Plan. And these were primarily put forward because of concerns about the sustainability of the wild food way of life supported by watersheds, fish, and wildlife. And we'll hear some more about these areas of critical environmental concern from Nikki later on. So what makes ACECs unique as a designation and a conservation tool? One of the things is that ACECs are really the only standalone conservation designation that is spelled out in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA. And FLPMA really mandates that BLM give priority to the designation and protection of areas of critical environmental concern. BLM certainly has other land designations that it may use to protect special lands, but only ACECs are rooted directly in the statute. And so this gives ACECs a unique position within the agency's planning process. And so how are ACECs brought forward in a planning process? They're brought forward through nominations. Tribes can nominate areas of critical environmental concern. The public can nominate them, and actually even BLM can nominate them from inside the agency. And so a nomination can be put forward, and it needs to explain how the area meets the relevance and importance criteria, and then demonstrate the need for special management. And ACECs can have any number of cultural, ecological, archaeological, scenic, geological, or other of those significant values. And nominators really have an opportunity to creatively consider how the designation might apply across different areas of interest or concern. Timing-wise, generally the earlier in the resource management planning process, the better. So usually that means either in kind of the pre-planning or scoping phase is the best time to put forward an area of critical environmental concern nomination. And then once it's established, what can an ACEC do? Again, ACECs are designated through this RMP processes at the final step, which is called the record of decision. And once finalized in a record of decision, an ACEC would specify which uses are allowed in the area. And the management plan would normally prohibit or restrict uses that could threaten the values for which the ACEC was created. And then once established, an ACEC lasts for the life of the resource management plan, which is usually about 20 years. And nearly all cases prior on the last administration, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on, but in nearly all cases, once an ACEC is established, they're carried forward into the next, when the plan is revised in the future. Great. So that was kind of the 101 overview of ACECs. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Laurel. Well, we're a little ahead of schedule, so if anybody has any questions, just raise their hand. You can also put them in the chat, and at the end of the 3 presentations, we'll have a chance to have a conversation and discussion and answer your questions there. So any initial questions for Laurel on the presentation?
Hi, sure. This is Tom. Laurel, thank you. It's really interesting presentation. One question that came to my mind is, can ACECs be nominated from outside the agency? Can it happen anytime, or is it only when these resource management plans are in progress?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. They can be nominated from outside the agency. So anyone from the public could nominate an area of critical environmental concern. A tribe could put one forward, as well as BLM, agency staff themselves could put forward a nomination.
Laurel, we have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is in regards to city-owned properties. The question is whether ACECs apply to city-owned properties.
Right. Yeah, ACECs only apply to lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. BLM.
Thanks for that clarification. Lisa Watt for EcoTrust is asking, how long does the process take once a nomination is submitted?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Lisa. So the planning process when a RMP is revised takes, I think we say usually like 5 to 8 years for the whole process to be completed, though it certainly does vary. We've seen them be completed more quickly. And so that would be essentially the timeline. If an ACEC is nominated at the beginning and then makes it all the way through and is designated at the end of that process.
And there's a follow-up from Lisa. How much documentation is required from a tribe, and this is a big one, how is privacy assured for some confidential information that the tribe might have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, BLM can certainly ensure that certain information is not shared with the public, and so to keep that information private, if it's about sensitive places or resources, things like that. The nomination itself can be pretty straightforward. There's essentially a form that the BLM has that can be filled out and explained how the values that folks are looking at, how those meet the relevance and importance criteria.
There's another question regarding the General Mining Act, the 1872 Mining Act. So does the ACEC's designation preclude activities allowed under the 1872 Mining Act? Which one trumps?
Neither. They exist simultaneously, if you will. But Bureau of Land Management lands can be withdrawn from mineral entry, and so ACECs can be withdrawn from mining. So not every acre of BLM land is always available for every single use at every single time. And so if there are resources that are sensitive to something like mining in an ACEC, one of the management prescriptions could be a recommendation for it to be withdrawn from mining.
Thank you for that. Another question goes to the resource management plans and sort of the 20-year cycle of those drafting and approval of those plans. It's asking, when does the next 20-year cycle begin? I'm assuming it's different for each region, but if you could explain a little bit more on sort of the timelines for those.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. So each plan is sort of on its own timeline. So it's staggered. So some of them might be right now ongoing. Some may have new starts coming up in the next couple of years. There are some plans that have already been in the works for a number of years and may be finalized soon. So it is staggered across each plan. It's a little bit on a different timeline.
Okay. And where would be a resource to find out on this particular regions and RMPs and the timelines? Is it the BLM? Do they have a repository on their website, or what would you recommend?
They do. There's an interactive map on BLM's website. We could probably send that around afterward too as a good resource to kind of show where plans are in the process and kind of which ones might be upcoming.
Oh, excellent. I think Suzanne Little in the chat said that she can share the interactive map. So yeah, if you could put the link in the chat, that would be great. Another question goes to when a submittal is made for ACEC designation, who at BLM or Interior is involved in evaluating that nomination, and who's the decision maker?
Really good question. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but basically BLM puts together what they call an interdisciplinary team. So it's usually comprised of scientists and resource specialists, and they go through and evaluate each ACEC nomination, and then they make a recommendation to see if they think that the area meets the relevance and importance criteria, and then that gets carried forward in the resource management planning process. And so the ultimate decision is made usually by either a field manager or the state office of the BLM.
Thank you for that. One concern or clarifying question that came up at NCAI and at ATNI in our Natural Resources Committee had to goes to the heart of our relationships, tribal relationships with the federal government, and treaty rights, and whether or not that the designation of ACECs will impact treaty harvest of salmon, other fisheries, wildlife, game, timber, medicines, everything that we've depended on for our way of life. We wanted to, if you could answer that, that would be really helpful, because that was one of the main concerns and questions that come from tribes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So no, an ACEC designation wouldn't affect treaty rights. Treaty rights would be carried forward. An ACEC designation could serve to better protect some of those resources. So because the BLM domain is primarily managed under that multiple use mandate, if there is an area that, so if one of the resources might be negatively impacted by, say, energy development, that area could be put forward to be an ACEC with certain management prescriptions that would ensure that that resource is protected from development in a stronger way than might otherwise happen.
Do you have an example, maybe of protecting a watershed, or so back to your slide of what ACEC protection would do, protecting or taking off mining interests or leases, protecting from further road development, other ways that could protect watersheds and the fish and salmon species that depend on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the watershed example is probably a good one. Watersheds were put forward by some of the tribes in Alaska to be ACECs to maintain the watershed and its integrity. As well, again, we'll talk about a little bit later. Those didn't make it through, and that's part of the reason that we're going to also talk about why the ACEC rulemaking could strengthen this as a tool. But that is, it would set forward management prescriptions that could better conserve something like a watershed that supplies drinking water or habitat for salmon or other species.
Thanks, Laurel. I think that's a great transition point to talk about how our brothers and sisters up in Alaska are dealing with the Bureau of Land Management and ACEC nominations. And we have an esteemed tribal leader, Mickey Stickman, who's the first chief from the Nulato Tribal Council, here to talk about how the Alaska Natives are dealing with the Bureau of Land Management and their protection of their watersheds and lands. So Mickey, I'll hand it over to you. I think you might be muted still.
Okay, so you can hear me now?
Got it. Yep.
Okay, so my name's, well, all my friends and family call me Mickey. My name's actually Michael, but I prefer Mickey. I was the first chief of the Nulato tribe for 7 terms, so 21 years. I was the first chief of the tribe, and in about the middle of my 20 years, I met Suzanne Little from the Pew Charitable Trust because of the resource management plan that the BLM agency was proposing, and so we didn't really understand anything about resource management plans because we weren't involved in the one that they were currently changing. But apparently, we learned that there was opportunities and places for tribes to sit at the table, but one of the things that thank our creator for the Pew Charitable Trust and for Suzanne herself, because Suzanne was the one, I sat down with her and we started talking about what's important to us as people, and and then that's when we I actually started looking at the resource management plan that the BLM was coming up for the Bering Sea Western area. But one thing that's important for everyone here to know is my tribe is actually in both plans, the Bering Sea plan and the Central Yukon plan. And so now we have an opportunity, because we didn't, all the areas of critical environmental concern that we nominated, all the tribes nominated in Alaska, were turned down. None of our nominations were approved. And so it's important to know that right off the top, that the tribes in Alaska weren't really treated fairly by the BLM administration. They didn't say, okay, we're coming up with a resource management plan, and they didn't say these are the places that you can interact and cooperate or make recommendations. It was only through Suzanne and the Pew Charitable Trust that were able to understand what was happening and going on, and then through that, well, it became super important for me, because one of the areas of critical environmental concern that we nominated was the Nolata River, and my village is actually about a mile, maybe about a mile away from the river, but the river itself is a salmon spawning river for Yukon River king salmon, silver salmon, and chum salmon. So that and then our actual village water supply come from the Nolata River itself. So it was really, really super important for us to try to get the Nolata River approved as a ACEC. The other one was, was a little further away up to not up the Yukon, but I live on the Yukon River, but 18 miles from where I live is a different river system called the Kayukuk River, and you go up the Kayukuk River, and you go 500 miles up the Kayukuk River, and there's Henshaw Creek, and Henshaw Creek was an area of critical environmental concern for my tribe, and it should have been for all the tribes, because 1/3 of all the silver salmon that we get in the fall time spawn in Henshaw Creek. So even though you live in one spot, an area of critical environmental concern can be up to 500, even 1,000 miles away. And even though there's other tribes that can nominate it, it's important for people to nominate as much as they could that they want to protect. Even though, the one thing that's important, is every single, they were, the BLM agency itself was, they were coming up with the resource management plan, they were moving forward, but they didn't have a glossary, or they didn't have any way, they didn't tell you, like I said, thank God for the Pew Charitable Trust in Sudan, we were able to understand the potential impacts and how we could try to mitigate those impacts. And one of those ways to mitigate it was to nominate areas for well, at the very beginning, you could nominate areas for a wilderness area, and then if that failed, you could nominate it again for ACEC, and if that failed, well, they're just that's it, huh? But it was really unfortunate, because the agency, the BLM agency people in Anchorage, Alaska, were very unfriendly to all the tribes. They never gave us a glossary. They never explained our rights. You know, we had no idea what our rights were until we sat down and had meetings with the Pew Charitable Trust and a few other people, and then we figured it out. But and then we started nominating areas. But I would say about 100. I mean, I'd say 100% of every area we nominated was not approved. So, it was just a very unfriendly atmosphere. So bad, that I really believe that the Alaska tribes that are in both resource management plans can actually sue the government, because and the stand-in would be they didn't give us definitions. They didn't give us a glossary. They didn't give us it's all in there, but they never tell you it's in there, and they never give you a definition of what it means. So without help, but we did figure it out and understand it and nominate areas, and even though we didn't get them, Nulato tribe, me as the chief, and my nephew Paul Mountain, who is the former tribal administrator, and Suzanne, we went out there and we tried to educate as many different chiefs and tribal administrators that this was a very important plan. And then we did get everybody on board. We have a commission for the Bering Sea Plan, and the commission now we're talking about co-management of BLM land in within our areas, and that's something that's totally brand new, co-management, but it's a goal, because if you rely on the resource and your tribe and people below you, because we live on the river, we can't just think about Nulato and not think about Caltag, Grayling, Anvik, Holy Cross, all those people below us. They live on the same river, so whatever we do affects everyone. So we were very lucky to actually have the Pew Charitable Trust coach us on our rights and help us try to navigate each resource management plan. So, the one area that we applied for or nominated in Nulato was it was important for us because for one, it's a spawning river. So the Yukon River king salmon, the Yukon River silver salmon, the Yukon River chum salmon, all spawn up in the Nulato River. But like I said before, and all of that is important because that's everything that we harvest. And then the other side of it is it's actually our water supply for the whole village. So we want to protect the water supply for the whole village. We don't want it any kind of potential contamination. So at this time, I will be asking you if you guys have any real specific questions, because like we actually had some sit-down meetings, and from the not from the last one, but from the time before that, when I pointed out that the BLM was just almost on the verge of racism when it comes to dealing with tribes, because like I said, they never ever gave us a glossary or a dictionary of the terms. So without coaching from Suzanne and then figuring out other areas on our own, because a lot of the work was done within the planning area. There was we have a tribal organization called Tanna Chiefs Conference. We had an expert from Tanna Chiefs Conference be a part of the coaches. We had Suzanne Little from the Pew Charitable Trust, and then from the you go up north into the Nome area, because the BLM land is so big. It's 30, something like 30 million acres big in Alaska. We had another tribal advisor from their organization, and so and then we had another advisor from the Yukon River Drainage Fishermen's Association. So once we figured it out, once we got all the tribes at the table, and they finally realized that this is important. We finally started getting participation, because, well, like I said, they never told you how important this plan was going to be. So I didn't know about it. I didn't know how important it was going to be. My friend, the chief in Caltag, didn't know how important it was going to be. My chief friend up in Kaikuk didn't know how important it was going to be. It was only through our conversations and our I actually to get the Nulato tribe on board with the reality. I actually invited Suzanne to come to Nulato and explain the resource management plan process. And but it's very important to for everyone on the Zoom meeting to know that we tried everything. We tried so hard to nominate areas of to nominate ACECs. We tried to understand the resource management plans as much as we could. The one thing that it's important for everyone to know is all these plans were sent out to the tribes in a PDF format, and a lot of tribes in rural Alaska, we just barely have a good internet connection. I mean, we all have internet. Everybody has internet, but your connection ain't 100%. It's never 100% all day long or forever. You do lose connection in the village. So, and then, one of the PDFs that they sent out was the original one. Well, the proposed plan. They wanted you to read the proposed plan and comment in 1 week. But before you even read the proposed plan, which I thought was pretty impossible, because it was 3,000 pages long. And they gave you 1 week to read the plan and to make your recommendations. And there's no way any rural village in Alaska will have an internet connection good enough to download 3,000 pages. Maybe it's possible in the bigger areas like Fairbanks, Nome, Kotzebue, but not in Nulato, not in Kaikuk, not in Caltag. So it's, and but we worked hard enough on it to make our voices heard, and we worked on it hard enough for them to realize that we were not going to go away. That's why we created the commission. Even though they say the plan is going to be good for the next 20 years or the next 30 years. Well, the commission's goal is to co-manage. And if you co-manage, that means you don't have to be involved every day, or all the time. You can, the BLM, they just want to come out with this resource management plan and then have it set in stone. But that's not the way we deal with it, because, the indigenous people in Alaska still live off the land primarily. We still live a lifestyle of eating berries, eating fish, eating moose, beaver, ducks, whatever the land provides, that's what we're going to be eating. So that's why it's so important for us to be involved in this resource management plans, because the Alaskan indigenous people, no matter where you go, they're going to be surviving off the land like they have done for thousands of years. You go to Nolado, for example, we have a little community store, but we don't have no Safeway, we don't have no Albertsons, we don't have no Fry's, we don't have no Fred Meyers, we don't have anything like that. We don't have no Costco, nothing. So our food source is the land and the area itself. So one of the other areas we nominated for ACEC was our pick and berry areas, where we pick berries for, because you only pick berries when they're ripe. You don't pick berries year round. But we try to pick the areas that have been traditional pick and berry areas for the tribe for centuries. So, and that was the real kicker for us as Indians and as tribal people, were to try to protect the resources that we depend on to survive. Because the BLM don't care. They don't care that there's an indigenous population that survive on this in this area. No, they, you have to fight to. I mean, they say they want your cooperation, they want your input, but my experience with the agency, the BLM, and the plans, and there's witnesses. There's other tribes that can say the same thing. Even though they say you have the right to nominate an ACEC, well, we all did, but every single nomination was turned down. They said you can be a cooperating agency tribe, and that's the other thing that they didn't define for you. What it means to be a cooperating agency tribe. You get extras. You get extras with being a cooperating agency tribes. Your seat at the table is a little more secure, so to speak. But even then, we not every single tribe that applied for cooperating agency status was actually given cooperating agency status, and I think that was, why offer something and then not give it to you? So we had to fight for our, and even though they say this is your rights, we had to fight for every single one, every step of the way. There was no time, no place. They said, okay, we're going to help you, and so that was my experience. But the thing is, you can't give up. And luckily with help, we were able to, okay, we're able to say, okay, we're not going to go away. We're going to create this commission. We're not going to go away. We're going to fight for our rights, no matter what. No matter what happens, we're gonna fight for these rights, and so that's where we're at right now. I mean, we're at a point right now where you know, the BLM bureaucracy in Washington D.C. is having a hard look at it because of the way the tribes were treated in Alaska, as far as the plans are concerned. Well, you define it in a court of law. They treated us so bad when it came to our rights in these plans that they realize now that we have standing. We can take them to court because we have standing, because they gave it to us. The way they treated us gave us that standing. So they know it could go either way. The tribes can say, okay, give us this, or we're going to sue the BLM. But and that's pretty much where we're at right now. But for my tribe, my tribe is not finished, because even though I'm not the chief anymore, I'm still going to be involved, because I still want to be involved where I can make a difference for the tribe. I don't have to be the chief anymore. I could be just a tribal spokesperson that have done it for 20 years. Or I can just be a concerned tribal member that continues to live off the land. But, either way you look at it, BLM is trying to figure out, what to do next. The tribes, we know what we want to do next. We want to co-manage.
Thank you so much, Mickey, for your work while on council. But as you said, you're still a leader. You're still fighting for the resources, the land, the waters that all the animals and the plants depend on, so you can carry on the way of life that you've been living for thousands and thousands of years. So Katsiaya, I really appreciate you. And when you talk about the mistreatment from the BLM, just so everyone is aware, this is the Trump administration. So we're talking about a couple of years ago. And you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk about potential legal avenues to challenge the way that the management plans were developed in Alaska, and with disregard for all the ACEC nominations from tribes. And you mentioned that there was a commission formed with over 37 Alaska tribes to continue this fight and continue this work. And thank you for doing that. And so I'd really like to transition to our legal expert on the Zoom webinar now, Mr. Mike Bloom, professor from Lewis and Clark Law School, to talk a little bit more about the legal ramifications of the designation of ACECs on BLM lands, but also talk specifically to what Mickey just educated us about with the disregard for the nominations from and lack of tribal consultation up in Alaska on those RMPs. So I'll hand it over to Mike. I think you're muted, Mike.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Joel, and thanks to ATNI and Pew for the opportunity to address you today. And I'd kind of like to piggyback a little bit on Laurel's slides. I don't have slides, but I don't need them because she's got all the slides I could imagine. So Laurel, if it's okay with you, I actually wrote down some numbers of slides that we could flip to make it a little bit easier to follow. From Mickey's experience, though, I do want to say that's a dismal record on the part of BLM. That in no way constitutes consultation with the tribes. Sending out a PDF with 1 week to respond to 3,000 pages is outrageous. So yeah, there might very well be some legal recourse there, and it may be time for BLM to revise those RMPs. I suppose the good news is that Mickey and his tribe and other tribes have realized that organization is paramount, and being a repeat player is really important. The tribes in the Northwest and the fishing battles that were fought beginning in the 1960s and 70s learned that, and they've never gone away. And they have co-management of the Columbia River fishery, at least on harvest, not so much on hydropower. But there's lessons there to be extrapolated from. 45 years ago, the Federal Land Management and Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, declared, and I quote, regulations and plans for the protection of public land areas of critical environmental concerns shall be promptly developed. They never have been. 45 years through 9 administrations, from the Ford administration through Biden, and they've been ignored. And it's an embarrassment to the BLM. Land plans, land management plans, which is the chief achievement of FLPMA, call for a priority given to the designation and protection of ACECs. That has only happened haphazardly because there's never been any regulations. There's no uniformity. As Laurel pointed out in slides, I think 4 and 5, Laurel, ACECs require special management attention to protect important historic, cultural, and scenic values. I think the emphasis should be on cultural values because though they're intergenerational values, they're not local. They're 7 generations. And ACECs should be managed and designated to protect important cultural special management attention can include and often does provide for consultation with tribes. That leads to what Mickey called co-management, what the new secretarial order calls co-stewardship. I suppose it doesn't matter what we call it so long as the tribes are involved in managing the lands and resources that are important to them. But we have not had any responsible implementation of the ACEC program for 45 years. That's an astonishing record of neglect by the executive branch, ignoring what Congress laid down in 1976, although I suppose I don't need to emphasize shocking nonfeasance to tribal peoples. The result is that there's only about 7% of BLM lands today that are designated as ACECs and no consistency among them. They're done differently in different states. They're done differently district by district. This is a federal program. It's not a local program. These are lands that are owned by the entire American people, and many of which have been ceded by indigenous tribes who have a profound attachment to them. Mickey went through the sorry experience in Alaska, which I won't repeat here in the interest of time. But there's also been recent land plan amendments in Montana that have eliminated ACECs, not only not designating them, but eliminating past ACECs. I'm not sure that's happened before the Trump administration. Less than 1% of BLM lands with wilderness characteristics would be protected by pending land management plans, according to a Pew study. Tribal nations should be outraged by this. And I think Mickey's got the right attitude. Form a commission. Don't go away. The Biden administration's much more friendly than the last administration, but it may not be around forever. The only solution is persistent involvement. And tribal nations are fully capable of that. The resolution of ATNI on ACECs is great. That's exactly the beginnings of involvement. But unfortunately, it's not enough. You got to participate. Letters, demand regulations, then participate in the regulatory process, and demand that the regulations fulfill promises that the secretary has just made and that the president has made about co-management, or at least tribal consultation leading to co-management. Over 5 years ago, in 2016, the Obama administration promulgated revised land planning regulations, which would have done a lot to revive the ACEC program. Those regulations were vetoed by Congress under a rather obscure statute called the Congressional Review Act. Under that statute, new planning regulations that the Biden administration might be considering can't be substantially similar to the vetoed regulations. So I want to suggest that they not be substantially similar by emphasizing cultural values and by emphasizing tribal consultation and co-stewardship, as the secretaries now call it. The revival of the ACEC program, or really the new beginning of it, is entirely consistent with President Biden's agenda. For example, he's now embarking on a goal of protecting 30% of the nation's lands and waters by 2030. I don't think he can do that without a revival of the ACEC program. As was pointed out earlier, this is the biggest land management program in the country, and it's got 7% ACECs. It needs to triple that in the next few years. It can only do that if we get good regulations promulgated and plans consistent with those regulations. Then once you get a plan with ACECs in it, all actions that BLM undertakes have to be consistent with the plan. That's one of the few substantive requirements that FLPMA, the statute, has. You have to be consistent. So it's really important to get good plans that are specific, that embrace tribal involvement and tribal consultation. Another Biden program is the secretarial order that was mentioned earlier, promulgated just last month on November 15th, signed by both the Agriculture and Interior Secretaries, that calls for protection of treaty, religious, subsistence, and cultural interests of federally recognized tribes to fulfill the federal trust obligation. This order calls for agreements between agencies and tribes to collaborate in producing co-stewardship of federal lands, to carry out other executive orders on sacred sites and consultation and coordination with tribal governments. That order promises tribal governments an integral role in decision-making via meaningful consultation at the earliest phases of decision-making to ensure that tribes can shape the direction of management. That didn't happen in Alaska. And in fact, that's what happened in Alaska is blatantly inconsistent with the secretarial order. That order also promises to incorporate tribal land plans into federal land planning and develop structures to implement co-stewardship. So tribal plans become part of federal plans that then become co-managed. Finally, there's a secretarial order from 2 months ago from Secretary Holland that promises, among other things, to protect cultural resources of tribes through cooperative management and collaborative partnership arrangements, carrying out FLIPMA's goal of cooperative agreements. So my suggestion is that tribes act on all these federal offers to and pressure the secretary to promulgate the overdue ACEC regulations, and in doing so, emphasize the importance of protecting tribal cultural and fish and wildlife values through what the secretary has called meaningful consultation. Let's call her on the carpet and say, deliver that. Produce co-stewardship along the lines maybe of the Bears Ears Advisory Committee. That may be what Mickey's commission should be looking toward. A collaborative interaction constantly between the federal agencies and tribal coalitions to ensure that ACEC regulations aren't substantially similar to the vetoed regulations. I think that the proposal should promise ACEC management will not act inconsistent with the protection of tribal cultural values or fish and wildlife resources. Maybe some kind of certification should be developed in the regulations that might resemble something like Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, where the states get to certify federal permits as being consistent with their water quality standards and other laws. I think tribes should have something similar in the ACEC regulations. Once an ACEC is designated, no activity could take place without some kind of consent of a tribal coalition or representatives, so that they could protect their ceded and ancestral lands from BLM actions. The FLIPMA doesn't have much in the way of substantive protection of resources, but it's got an opportunity to have that through ACECs. And given the sorry record over the last 45 years, it's going to be up to the tribes to revitalize this program. I also think, and just in closing, that the regulations that I hope will be developed would call upon BLM to nominate in ACEC consideration national monuments. The national monuments offer some more permanent protection because they're presidential. Well, maybe BLM, in designating an ACEC that has tribal consultation, should make recommendations to the president about national monuments. It could do something similar with wilderness study areas. So the regulations could accommodate other kinds of protection. One of Laurel's slides, which I didn't write down, I'm sorry, Laurel, had anti-backsliding in it. The regulation should make it harder for BLM to withdraw ACEC designations by putting the burden of proof on BLM when they're trying to delete an ACEC, a designated ACEC. And those regulations should also pursue co-stewardship by deferring to tribal recommendations about what gets designated in the ACEC regulations. So I think there's a lot of work ahead. As Mickey said, organization is the key, and the time frame is, I think, fairly short. I think something has to happen on ACECs within the next year, or it might not happen for a long time in the future. And I hope that doesn't happen. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate your knowledge, and I think you highlight the huge opportunities now that we have with the Biden administration. There's a new BLM director. The agenda of this administration has been focused on, addressing impacts to climate change and conserving lands and waters and protecting biodiversity, and a huge reemphasis on respecting tribal treaty rights and tribal sovereignty and engagement. And so, yeah, we need to take advantage of this current landscape right now. And you mentioned a bunch of possibilities and avenues that we can keep the pressure on this administration to really establish these consistent ACEC regulations. And so I'd like to bring Laurel back in the conversation to jump off on that and really focus in on how tribes can impact this policy and really push hard to get these changes, much needed changes made to protect their waters and their lands.
Thanks, Joel. And thanks, Professor Blum. And this is great because I think you've covered a lot of the things here. And so I'm gonna, this is kind of the last, oops, I'm on the wrong slide, but this will just be the last section here. So I'm going to just talk about a little bit more from this policy perspective and what the need for the rulemaking and opportunities are for an ACEC rulemaking. So, we've heard here already today about the potential here, right? The significance or the potential for ACECs to have significant impacts to protecting culturally and ecologically valuable landscapes across the BLM's domain. The original intent of the law really was, it directed the Department of the Interior to do that rulemaking that would have outlined how ACECs could be designated and managed. But despite that FLTMA's original intent, we still haven't seen a rulemaking 4 decades later. And so what we see instead is the application of ACECs across BLM's domain is inconsistent. And what we specifically saw during the last administration was really an almost wholesale elimination of existing ACECs that had been in place for, in some cases, decades. And I'll talk more specifically about some of those in a second here. And these opportunities that we have right now, new leadership in Washington, new BLM director, the first ever Native American Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Holland. This is really the moment for the agency and for the department to fulfill this promise of the rulemaking and elevate ACECs and plans and really make this tool something that can be significant moving forward. Professor Blum also mentioned this, the joint secretarial order that was issued in this past November by both Department of Interior and Agriculture, specifically calling out co-stewardship. And, there's some really great language in here about tribes being meaningfully consulted early in planning and decision-making. So again, I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but incorporating some of these principles of this secretarial order, as well as some of those other executive orders into an ACEC rulemaking, could really help to address some of those injustices that Mickey noted in their efforts to protect the ACECs that they put forward. I'm going to just run through a couple really specific examples that just help to kind of underscore the need for a rulemaking. I'm going to talk about kind of 3 examples in plans that we saw during the last administration where ACECs were really eliminated. So the first, so I'll talk about 2 plans in Montana and 1 in Alaska. The first one here is in Lewistown, Montana. You can kind of see the planning area here, kind of central Montana area. Most of the BLM lands are concentrated over in sort of the eastern area here. And this plan was started in about 2014, and then it was wrapped up in the final days of the last administration. I think it was January 4th, 2021. Or excuse me, 2020 was wrapped up. And what we saw in this plan is that the BLM, the interdisciplinary team that I talked about earlier, they analyzed 11 ACECs, both existing and proposed new ones, And through their analysis, they found that 10 of those met the relevance and importance criteria. So it's about 32,000 acres within this planning area. But despite this recommendation by BLM's own planning staff, when the draft plan was released, it proposed to eliminate every single ACEC, zeroing them out across the board, again, including existing ones that had been on the books for many years. Some of the ACECs that were specifically proposed to be eliminated, one was the Square Butte area that we talked a little bit about earlier that has those really significant archaeological sites. Another was a place called Collar Gulch that is really important for West Slope cutthroat trout, Townsend Figures bats. There's a special cave that has really significant resources in this area. And then another area, the Judith Mountains Scenic ACEC. It's one of the few forested mountain islands in this whole region. These are all proposed to be eliminated in that plan. In another area of Montana, further, so western Montana, this is called the Missoula Resource Management Plan. This started, it was on a very similar timeline as Lewistown, so started in about 2014 or so and wrapped up again. I think that the record of decision was actually signed the same day, January 4th of last year. And so again, what we saw, very similar. There's not quite as many ACECs in this area, but a similar story where 8 ACECs were analyzed by the BLM's own planning staff. 4 of them were found to meet the criteria and they were recommended. But when that draft plan came out, only 1 ACEC was recommended to be designated and 3 existing ones were recommended to be, or were proposed to be eliminated. Fortunately, when the final plans came out, we did see a couple of these ACECs brought back in, and that was in large part due to extensive public comment. Then Governor Bullock got involved. So there was a lot of work put in, and a few of the ACECs were brought back in. However, we saw that the management prescriptions were essentially lowered. So, that Square Butte area previously was closed to motorized use to protect those resources, and it was opened. The Judith Mountains area was put into a special recreation management area with lesser management that really wouldn't protect those values that the ACEC had originally been designated for. Going back to Alaska, so we've heard a lot about this already. Many of these ACECs were put forward. Another one, just to highlight, is the Anvik River. The Anvik tribe nominated the Anvik River watershed because of the importance of the river for salmon spawning and really to the whole Yukon River system. And again, BLM they agreed with the values. In their report, they said, the Anvik River is considered the largest single wild stock producer of salmon, of summer chum salmon in the Yukon River drainage and possibly the world. Yet this area was not designated as an ACEC. In all, it was about 12 million acres that were nominated by tribes in Alaska for ACEC protection. Beyond all of these nominations, and then even went back and proposed to eliminate. So we did a deep dive analysis on all the plans that moved forward under the last administration. There were 6 plans. You can see kind of along the left side here, the Bering Sea, Western Interior, those 2 plans in Montana. There was a plan in Idaho, one in Oregon, and one in Eastern Colorado. And we looked to see how many ACECs were found to meet that relevance and importance criteria, and then how many were actually then carried forward and included in the draft plan, and how many were proposed to be removed. And you can see there's some zeros on here of how many were actually included to be designated by the agency, and then some pretty high numbers and how many were proposed to be removed. We also looked at some of these other designations as well, lands with wilderness characteristics, backcountry conservation areas, and wild and scenic rivers. So we kind of looked at the whole picture. We found conservation was slashed across the board. Specifically for the ACECs, across 20 million acres in those 6 BLM planning areas, 94% of ACECs were proposed to be removed in the agency preferred alternatives. Only 2.1% of the ACECs that were, again, found to meet the criteria by BLM's own folks. Only 2.1% were included in those preferred alternatives. And so, these experiences in Alaska and these other plans really underscored that even though ACECs have this strong legal underpinning, they, without an agency rulemaking, they're not going to be able to be really properly utilized here. And so what an agency rulemaking can do, I think Professor Blum covered most of it already, but really just fulfilling that FLTMA mandate, right? Incorporating an anti-backsliding provision so that we can inoculate ACECs against the political winds, incorporating this co-stewardship secretarial order, really codifying that in the agency rule, requiring the incorporating Indigenous knowledge, highlighting and incorporating how ACECs can contribute to climate resilience and to help achieve the America the Beautiful goals of protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. An ACEC rulemaking could really spell out how ACECs could be helped to address environmental justice concerns and health concerns that communities experience. All of these things and probably much more. Again, it will be key that if this comes forward, that folks get involved and really get their voices heard on what they'd like to see in an agency rulemaking to really strengthen ACECs as a tool moving forward. Opportunities, I think resolutions like ATNI did is absolutely fantastic. That's so powerful, and that's really, I think, has been noticed by leadership at BLM and the Department of Interior. Individual tribes have put forward letters as well, and certainly others can continue to do that. And then, of course, nominating plans, ACECs and plans moving forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. Again, I think the political moment is now to really make a difference in getting a rule that can help us get this ACEC tool to be a really great one moving forward.
Thank you, Laurel. Any questions? That we've put a lot on your plate, but I think that it was much needed. The different perspectives of ACECs, just understanding them, and the experiences that tribes have had, and then how are we gonna move forward, and how tribes can be engaged and really take advantage of the political landscape now, and get some protections put into place that'll be longstanding and not to be removed by the next administration. So I think that that like goes to your point of the anti-backsliding as well. But any questions for Laurel before we go ahead, Mickey?
I don't have any questions, but the one thing that is important for everyone to know is that BLM right now have a conundrum, because BLM Alaska, was so unfriendly to the Alaska tribes that they gave us the stand-in that we have a possibility of going to court and fighting for those rights that they gave us, but didn't serve us with. So BLM Washington, the boss, and BLM Alaska have this conundrum that that they're dealing with. So now they have to backslide and say, okay, how can we fix this without getting sued? But that's the whole thing about lawsuits is, it was not only the Alaska tribes that were treated unfairly. It was every single tribe in the nation. So maybe it's time for every single tribe in the nation to file a lawsuit against our federal government. The other thing that was, I think that's important for everyone on the call to understand is, when the Alaska Native Land Claims Act was adopted by the United States, and they created corporations and gave us money and gave us land. Well, unfortunately, the guys who crafted it and who adopted it were were not, well, they didn't have their sharpest pencil because they, when the act actually, extinguished our Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. And but because they realized that that it was that was on and that's a federal law, and under federal law, our fishing and hunting rights are protected, our subsistence rights are protected, but there's nowhere in these resource management plans where they reference ANILCA or even talk about ANILCA. So maybe, because, and that was the one question that they couldn't answer when I asked it. I asked the question because BLM Washington was in Alaska, and we sat down, we had a meeting, and I asked the question about how does ANILCA figure into this, because ANILCA give us our subsistence hunting and fishing rights. And so what does these two, how does it play out? And they couldn't answer my question.
Yeah, I think you're right when we talk about headquarters versus individual states and the regions. They weren't on the same page, and I hope with this new leadership from Secretary Holland and President Biden and the new BLM director that they're going to get on the same page, and that message is going to be one of respect of tribal sovereignty and tribal rights and cultural resources. And it's because we have tribal leaders such as yourself and some others that are on the Zoom call now, coming together and as one, really driving this change. And we have an ATNI resolution, and there was a question in the chat about what resources we can provide tribes to advocate for this for these changes at their individual BLM offices within their states, but also back in Washington, D.C., where the ultimate decision makers are going to be. And so I'll hand it over to Eddie Sherman to talk about that and wrap up our discussion here today.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Laurel and Mickey and Mike for presenting really thoughtful information on this ACEC issue. And I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. There has been a number of different messages requesting follow-up information on the slides that were covered during our session today, as well as some additional information on how support for tribes. So we do have draft letters of support that we can send out along with this. And we'll also be working with ATNI to park this recording of this session on their website and making that available for folks that were not able to join us this afternoon as well. So we'll continue to follow up with information that's helpful and useful in this process. And I want to give everyone a heads up that we are also working on coordinating a breakout session during the ATNI Winter Convention with BLM leadership. And obviously it's going to be a virtual event given the current public health environment. So as soon as we get that additional information, we will continue to send that out to folks that registered for this session. And I know that will be another layer of conversation where we engage BLM leadership to provide so they can hear tribal perspectives on this issue and the importance of it, and thoughts on co-management, incorporating indigenous knowledge, and really positioning tribes to play a stronger role in this process. So again, thank you, everybody. We appreciate it that you've been able to join us for this afternoon for this session. And please look forward to seeing some additional emails from us with regards to the slides, the recording, some draft letters of support, and I can make myself and my team available to provide any additional information that might be helpful for those that want to play a role in this advocacy effort. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mickey.
Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for
Thanks, Nick.
attending, taking the